The way you have to prevent the fentanyl crisis is that you actually have to provide thriving family structures in religious communities in which people feel comfortable looking for help, but also can find a wife, can have children, are expected to do these things. And that means leaving behind the things of childhood and actually taking on an obligation to live a more fulfilled and better life, not just for yourself, but for your community. Because without that social fabric and you taking part in building that social fabric, it doesn't just fall apart for you, it falls apart for everybody. Very often in politics, we argue about the things that are at the top of the iceberg, but we very rarely get to the bottom of the iceberg. So the thing that I would say that the fentanyl crisis and maybe the trans issue have in common is that the thing that has been dissolving in American life for a very long time is the fundamental family structure. When the fundamental family structure dissolves, what you end up with is atomistic individuals. Atomistic individuals make bad decisions. They tend to be depressed. They tend to be upset. They tend to be volatile. And so a huge variety of issues in America are just aspects of this, ranging from school shootings to the fentanyl crisis to broken families and higher crime rates to the trans issue, right? All of these things are, as social fabric falls away, then sort of the nakedness of the raw humanity is left unleashed. And you're seeing a lot of aspects of that. So I don't think that they're utterly unrelated. I think that people like to talk about the trans issue on both sides because it's an issue with like very, very clear demarcated lines. And so that's a fun issue to talk about because if you're on the right, you look at this, you're like, this is just crazy. I could talk about this all day, how crazy this is, because it's so crazy. And if you're on the left, you're like, oh, those intolerant bigots. I love calling them bigots. This is my favorite thing, is to call them bigots. And so it's a fun issue for people to talk about. Fentanyl is a less fun issue to talk about for people, not just because it involves mass death, but also because it actually implicates some deeper issues that make people very uncomfortable. You're actually going to have to talk about things like, is this happening because of, as the right will maintain sometimes, trade and the outsourcing manufacturing jobs, or is this actually happening because of the thing that very few people want to touch, maybe across the aisle, which is no one goes to church anymore. Fewer and fewer kids are growing up with two parents in the household. There's no social fabric. There's no social structure. There's no one to keep an eye on these kids. When that happens, that perhaps men losing their role in society as protectors and providers for their family actually unmoors them and makes them depressed and more likely to get into drug use. Right? Like these are really deep, kind of fundamental philosophic issues, and I think most people tend to shy away from those because it's not as fun. Right? It's not as memeable. It's not as kind of TikTokable. And again, it gets to some really uncomfortable things about individualism in the age of the post-Enlightenment, right? I mean, like what I'm talking about is actual things that create obligations and duties for people, right? I'm talking about now like what you should do with your life. I'm not just talking about what you shouldn't do or what's stupid. I'm talking about like the things that you should do in life to make a thriving society. And that comes with actual rules. It comes with things you have to do. And the minute you say to somebody, this comes with obligation, people go, right? Because if you say, the way to prevent the fentanyl crisis, it's not just an easy thing about like bombing cartels. The way you have to prevent the fentanyl crisis is that you actually have to provide thriving family structures in religious communities in which people feel comfortable looking for help, but also can find a wife, can have children, are expected to do these things. And that means leaving behind the things of childhood and actually taking on an obligation to live a more fulfilled and better life, not just for yourself, but for your community. Because without that social fabric and you taking part in building that social fabric, it doesn't just fall apart for you, it falls apart for everybody. People immediately go, wait, you want me to do a thing? Like, I didn't sign up for this. I signed up to listen to a political show, right? I signed up to watch CNN. I signed up to watch Fox News. I signed up to watch somebody yell at how if I just change this politician, then that'll fix the thing. This is why I think there's so much faith in politicians, which is also why everything is polarized. No one should have faith in politicians. Politicians are representatives of the people, which means inherently that if you worship a politician, you're an idol worshiper. You're actually worshiping yourself. You elect the politician, then you mold the golden calf to your specifications, and then you worship it. And you say, why isn't it doing the thing I want it to do? And if only I just replaced this golden calf with that golden calf, then that would be better. But perhaps the real work that we all have to do is not just solved by going into the voting booth and pulling the lever on a particular politician. Maybe the actual work that we have to do is the hard work of getting up at 3 o'clock in the morning with your kids and doing your homework with your kids and battling through whatever hardships you have in your marriage to maintain your marriage, and then taking care of your parents as they get older and making sure that the people in your community, if they're coming on hard times, actually have something to fall back on, but also making sure that they're incentivized to go out and work again. Like these are actually the hard everyday things. And my belief is, obviously I'm an Orthodox Jew. I think in the absence of religious structure, it's very difficult to promote these things. But those are, again, conversations.
But you also believe in facts, Ben, and the fact of it is that most people are increasingly less religious in Western society, right? So I was going to ask you this because, of course, I understand. And by the way, we spent time with religious conservatives, and it's wonderful to see the positive sides of that. All of the things you've just talked about, and they are. I agree with you 100%. Those things are incredibly important for society to thrive. But the fact is, we've had different guests on the show, Louise Perry and Mary Harrington, talking about the sexual revolution and how that unleashes all of this process 60s onwards. But all I'm saying is, I put it to you that your solution, which is right for you and right for many religious people in this country, is increasingly less taken up, whether you and I like it or not.
I agree with you that it's
So what do we
less
do
taken up.
about that? How do we encourage people who are not religious? When Peterson had me on his podcast, we talked about a lot of this. How do you instill some of the values in a society that doesn't believe in God as much?
Right, so I think Jordan is really great about this, which is the idea that you take on obligations to do something higher, and then you'll find yourself doing something. So do the thing right in front of you. I think Jordan is really great at this. As an Orthodox Jew and a proponent of my own religion, obviously, I think that my religion is very Aristotelian in its approach to life, which is you get up in the morning and there's a bunch of things you have to do. And if you do those things, then you'll grow increasingly virtuous and you'll grow increasingly close to God. Now, you can be Aristotelian, not really bring God into it very much. You can say you can grow increasingly close to virtue. I think that's stepping one short logically, because then the question is, how do you define virtue? Where does virtue come from? Is there an objective standard of virtue, or is it all just moral relativism? That's why I'm religious. But if you don't wish to go there, if you just wish to stop at that step without going to God or without going to church or any of that stuff, first of all, you're going to have to find a community of people who agree with you. People who actually want to build that community with you. Maybe they're not so religious, but they have the same set of values as you do. And then you're going to have to, actually undertake those obligations in a really methodical and thought out way. Now, the reason I say that religion provides a structure is because traditionally that has been the structure. Now, what's fascinating is that you can be a non-religious person living in a society that values religion, and a lot of that stuff sort of bleeds over to you through the water, through osmosis. So here I'll take the example of Israel. What's fascinating about Israel is that Israel has a reproduction rate of currently something like 3. Okay, it is the only Western country that is reproducing at above replacement rates, literally the only one. And it's not just reproducing at the rate of 3, there's a huge disparity between the people who are religious and the people who are secular. But so the people who are the most religious, like the Haredim, the ultra-Orthodox, they're having somewhere between, I think they're averaging 7 kids. The people who are Dati Lumi, which is religious Zionist, which is probably where I would fall if I were living in Israel, they're having like 4 to 5 kids, right? I have 3, I'm having a 4th, that's fairly typical. And then the seculars are having 3 kids. Why are the seculars having 3 kids? They're the only secular people anywhere in the Western world who are having 3 kids. Why? And the answer is because the entire culture values having children. When you see people having kids around you, you're like, that's cool. I would also like to have kids. It seems like that'd be amazing. Maybe 2 kids isn't enough. The guy across the street has 8. They seem amazing. Like they're really happy. And so you see that sort of bleed down. So even if you're not, I think that you can have a society in which you have Voltaire, so long as Voltaire's recognize what Voltaire did, which is, I don't believe in God, but I sure hope my maid does. Right, otherwise she'll steal the silverware, is his famous line, right? But I think that as Western civilization becomes increasingly individualistic and anti-religious, it's not just like sort of apathetic about religion, it's become antagonistic toward religion. I think that bleeds over into a secular world that was living off sort of the fumes of a religious society, but as those fumes dissipate, what you end up with is, what do I do this morning? How do I get up? What is the moral obligation? What's in it for me? Okay, so the religious ideal was always, and this is why, again, you can do the Stoic thing, right? There's Stoic philosophers who say, you get up in the morning, you do virtue. That's great. That may work for some people. I hope it works for a lot of people, right? I think it's a valuable belief system.
That's the route I think I take in Francis too.
Yeah, I think that there are people who want to do that. I think that's great. That's wonderful. I think for the vast majority of people throughout human history, again, the thing that orients you is the idea that when you get up and you have a duty, it's not a duty just because you think it's good to have the duty. It's a duty because you are enjoined to do the thing. Right? What makes you? So I'll ask you guys. What makes you do the thing you don't want to do? Right? You have an 11-month-old baby, so having a lot of kids, it's a pain in the ass, right? They're wonderful. As I always say to people, in life, when you're a single dude, basically your sort of spectrum of happiness to sadness is like a 10 to a 0. And then you get married, and it goes from like a 20 to a negative 20, because if something bad happens with your spouse, it's really terrible. And then you have kids, and all limits are removed. The best things in your life will be your kids, and the worst things by far in your life will be your kids. It's really tough. Parenting is not an easy thing. So what motivates you that, it's 3 o'clock in the morning, your kid took a dump, and now you have to change the diaper? What makes you get up as opposed to just turning over and saying to your wife, you deal with it, I'm going back to sleep?
Well, for me, the duty is an obligation I took up on myself when we decided to have a child. That's what I signed up to do.
So why did you do that? Well, what drove you to make that decision? Because that's the question. Because people increasingly are not making the decision to get married, and then even if they do get married, to have kids. Right? We're at an all-time low in terms of people getting married and having kids.
Look, my view is there's a biological explanation for why we all want to have kids, right? So, and actually, my wife and I put it off quite late, probably later than we ought to have done. I'd love to bang out 5 as well at this point. But anyway, for me, I think it's the biological drive to procreate.
So the only problem with that is that was true, and it was maintainable before the birth control pill, right? Because the biological drive to procreate. So 2 things happen: the birth control pill and the feminist movement. So there are 2 real drives. Men had babies because they couldn't stop having babies. And women had babies because not only could they not stop having babies, they actually wanted to have babies, and they were in touch with the idea that it is good for a woman to have a baby. Now you have entire movements that teach women that the highest form of life is don't get married until you're close to 30, if you do get married. If it's gonna inhibit your career, then you should probably freeze your eggs and wait until you're maybe 40. Then you have a risky pregnancy at 40 in which we, fertilize the egg and maybe implant it in you. And that's like the apotheosis of civilization. And women, by all available polling data, are significantly less happy than they were in the 1970s.
You're preaching to the choir. I said something completely innocuous about this on Twitter. I've been dealing with feminists giving me shit for a week now. So I'm familiar with the argument.
But the bottom line is that how do you reverse that? So there are only 2 ways, especially because you can see, as countries get richer and as birth control becomes more plentiful, the original pitch for having kids was twofold. 1, you had a religious obligation to have kids. And 2 was they were labor on your farm. Right, those were the original. Now, kids are a net cost. It costs you a lot of money to have a child. It is not an economic, not only that, you had kids because when you got old, they were gonna take care of you. Now you have social welfare nets that take care of you. So what's the economic case for there's no economic case for having kids.
No, there isn't.
It disappeared. It's now a reverse economic case. If you wanna live high on the hog, you don't have kids. You go to vacation in Rome, but you don't have kids. And so that's a real problem. But how do you overcome that? And so then it has to be something like a woman desperately wants to have kids, and the only way that she is going to have kids is if she makes the rules that a man has to marry her in order to have the kids. So you have to overcome 2 things societally. 1, you have to teach women it's good to have kids. And 2, you have to teach women that actually men's standards for sex are the wrong standards for sex. That if you wish to have long-lasting, fulfilling relationships, then hopping in and out of the sack with people isn't actually a form of liberation. It's a form of bondage to a certain extent. You're training yourself to how males tend to think about sex rather than what is fulfilling for females. A biological function that has existed for literally all of humankind's existence. These are heavy lifts. It seems to me that the shortcut on these lifts, which is proved out by literally every demographic study done in the West, is that if you say God told you to have kids, you have a duty to have kids, it is good to have kids, and you're trained in that from the time you're little. Like my kids, again, right now, they're 9, by the time they're 7, and 3, and in the womb. And I asked my 3-year-old daughter how many kids she wants to have. Like, it's ingrained in her. It's ingrained, like my son, I'll ask him how many kids he wants to, he'll say, I want to have 4 kids, right? Because we're gonna have 4 kids, like that's the way it works. I ask, like you actually have to bring your kids up in this way, and which is why, across Western society, there are exceptions who will do the thing. You'll do the thing, people will do the thing, but that's a lot rarer. If you look at the demographic profiles, the only populations in the West reproducing at above replacement rates are in the United States, for example, Mormons, religious Catholics, religious Jews, religious Muslims, religious Protestants. That's it. No one else is reproducing at above replacement rates. So unless those are like the bulk of your population, and then those values sort of bleed over into the rest of the population, which is not the case in the United States, then you're going to have a declining birth rate, and then you're going to have to do it through immigration. Then that's going to come with whatever attendant problems mass immigration comes with, right? Demographic problems are a real thing. So I get a question a lot. So obviously I talk about religion a lot, and people will say, I don't believe in God, but I have kids. Should I go to church? And my answer is yes, you should go to church. If you grew up Christian and that's your religion, you should go to church. Because you know what? That may be the way that your kid understands the values the best. It's very difficult to make a sophisticated argument to a 3-year-old. It really is. When they're 20 and they have questions about God and they say, listen, I can't get there, you can say, like, listen, I'll make an argument for God, but maybe you don't want to, maybe that's not your thing, fine. But you know who can't handle that argument? A 3-year-old.
Yeah.
And niceness is not a moral value system.